Moduls Rīga piedāvā.
Well, let's say it this way. The creative musician have always thought about how you interact or connect with the social and political and spiritual sphere in society. They've always looked at that as being part of their domain. The songs and the traditions of the civil rights movement were more centered around gospel music and religious music. So they didn't really take that community of musicians and bring them into the fold to play along with this movement about social freedom and integration and stuff like that. They kind of went the other direction. But the notion of freedom was announced by the music, and if they had, that is, if the African American community, this liberation community, had brought that music within the context to help them in the struggle, it would be much greater along the way. Right now it still stands where it was back then. In some cases, worse. And not only because they made, there was not a clear decision to use this music, but for a lot of other reasons as well. Okay. There are notions of social progress, but you can measure them on a small equation as opposed to real human rights. You see. So yeah, that music announced the notion of freedom. It shows clearly ideas about democratic principles. The way in which those ensembles are led, they're led in the most effective way for the best of that community, was to be 5 pieces or in Elgin's case 20 pieces or 25 pieces. They were democratic unions functioning just like a real democracy should function, you know, because you have the composer, you have the leader, you have the individual people that play in the ensemble, and all of them, from leader to composer to performer, has the opportunity to make history, to create a legacy. Unlike in a lot of other kinds of ensembles, that you don't have that opportunity. So yeah, it's close. That ensemble, that idea of liberation was a great idea. It still is fascinating. We still look for some kind of way in which this music would be modeled against our society, how it should actually be ran. Baby Dodd, the drummer, there's a book, a small book on his life, and he's asked about this music. He calls the music, and this is in the 20s or 30s, he called this music creative music, and he says that it's a music that's not for everybody. It's a creative art music. He says that. Now, obviously, that writer probably appreciated his music, but never appreciated his words. Because if he did, he would actually know that Johnny Dodd and Leo Hart and Armstrong and Louis Armstrong, they wasn't entertainers. They were making art. And it shows that they were making art. They did something that nobody ever did on the planet before. No one. Louis Armstrong organized through his musical practice how to articulate harmonic progression. That had never been done before in no musics. Western music, Asian music, African music, never been done before. Okay? So, and that whole ramification of how you do music with harmonic progression it evolved from him to Lester Young, from Lester Young to Charlie Parker, from Charlie Parker John Coltrane. And John Coltrane's sheets of sound sealed it off. And Ornette Coleman's homolytic explosion opened it back up for another 1,000 years or 2,000 years into what we call systemic music. Not free music, not jazz, but systemic music, music of systems.
Do you believe your music is not for everybody?
I believe that my music is for everybody, but everybody will probably have a larger struggle to get it. And the reason I say that has to do with the fact that it's not played on the radio, okay? It's not often in newspapers, and it's played usually in the context of other musics where people make a big difference, that this is different than that, so maybe I want to hear that and not this. So it's more difficult for it to be part of a larger community because of the fact that it's not treated like those other musics that's part of the large community. Like, it's very easy to make creative music open for everybody, but it has to be on the radio and television and etc. Newspapers. I mean, most newspapers now don't even write about this music, you know. And the first thing that they cut is writers that write about this music. So yeah, it's music created without a distinction of its population or its audience. But the practical view of it is that it's a music that's not competing with any other music, and therefore it probably is going to be more of an esoteric element. Okay. Yeah. When we talk about freedom, we don't really mean that you can do anything that you possibly think that you want to do. We don't mean that. What we mean by freedom is this, is that the notion of making art gives you the opportunity to create it in the best way that you can possibly do it. And that best way comes out of the greatest set of disciplines. You cannot make your sound different if you don't have skills to manipulate the horizontal structure of what you're doing, or the vertical structure of what you're doing, or the sound structure of what you're doing, or the rhythmic structure of what you're doing. You can't do that. So it becomes a one kind of dimensional something. And I would argue that the greatest of this creative music has everything in it that all the other great music have in it, except that it's music of these times and not of yesterday times. To make a multiphonic sound, hardly nobody on the trumpet ever thought about that before the 50s. And the only guy that spoke out loud about it was Booker Little. And yet, with him speaking out loud about it, he was not able to articulate it. He was not able to do it. You have no multiphonics in his music, but he talked about it, okay? And guys like Don Cherry and Lester Bowie and Vadada Leo Smits, those guys did it. And each one of us did it differently. Lester Bowie did it by overblowing, a power of blowing. Don Cherry did it by the weakness of his chops. He took advantage of his weakness and made those multiphonic sound good. I do it by science. I do it by controlling the vibration that takes place right here in the embouchure. All very different. And now you got young performers coming up. They all do multiphonics everywhere. But before Don Cherry, Lester Bowie, and Vadada Leo Smits, nobody did them, you see. And Don Olive, had to put him in there. Yeah, nobody did them. So that's a considerable notion about discipline, because each one of them are done with intent. Don Olive does his by blowing hard and creating a buzzing sound where his pitches are that wide as opposed to being like that. And he's got buzz all around them. Those are multiphonics. All four of those examples are created in an entirely different way which means that the technology of producing the sound required skill and actual research. There are lots of notions about narratives that go along with my music, but not in a programmatic way. For example, my story is that I look at the psychological nature that music implies and that music causes a response to, okay? Like when I do a work that's called the Great Lakes, for example, okay, I'm looking directly at the image of that lake, the volume of water that it contains, the kind of waveform that it has in terms of waves, and history in terms of commerce and people living around it, and all those things. I'm looking at the whole gamut of it. I take the research into that, and if I talk about it, it becomes a narrative. You see, like for example, in the Lake Michigan, for example, because of the cargo and stuff that used to run on there are thousands of ships in the bottom that they have not pulled out, and they would never pull out, with cargo and everything. You see, there are beautiful documentaries about those commercial vehicles and their plight, because on Lake Michigan a storm can come up on the very clearest day within an instant and you're in trouble, you see. So yeah, there are stories, there are deeply connected stories. No, because see, music don't really capture the story. Music allows the opportunity to reflect, and whatever we reflect on becomes the fruit of that music, you see. Because no one can point to an E flat or a D or F sharp and say that represents rain or noise or whatever. You can't do it, because music is a something that's out of the dimension of creation, and that dimension of creation has it so that it's independent of individual identities, but can be characterized by a composer performer into his or her special identity, you see. So it's free of anything that's concrete like that. And it's the top of the arts, by the way. I say it, and so does Kandinsky, the Russian painter. He says the same thing. He has a book that's called Notes on the Spirituality of Art. And in there he defined music as being the highest category of art. And I could say it in a even real much simpler nutshell than he did. Music is the highest level of art because you can't find it anywhere in our planet, in our society. It's the thing that's immaterial. All the other arts represent elements that we can touch and feel and put together, you see. All of the other arts does. In other words, music, you can't represent it by a tree, you see. But an artist can represent that tree, sculpture can represent that tree, and photograph, the whole bit can represent that tree. Therefore, it's part of the earth. But show me music. Where does it grow? Where does it stand? Where does it exist? It's an immaterial something that permeates every head on the planet and every heart on the planet, but without carrying weight or volume or dimension or depth. All music that is organized into systems and not concept, but systems and theories and stuff like that, those usually are languages, okay? And when one say musical language, we're talking about a set of parameters that determine success or failure of their uses, just like in the spoken language. You know, if a guy can't ask how do you go to the store in any language and he needs to go to the store, he's unsuccessful, okay? So music is a language that prescribes the means and practice of those organized symbols that have been constructed for it. But composers and individuals, performers, can imply other meanings to those musical elements or renditions. They can apply other meanings to them. I can say, for example, that my Lake Superior is about Lake Superior, okay? But the music itself does not prove that. Let's see, I prove that by calling it Lake Superior. And no one else can unprove it by calling it not Lake Superior. Because if they did, they wouldn't be talking about Lake Superior. They'd be talking about not Lake Superior. So it cannot be proven each way, but nevertheless, the composer has the last word. If he says that this is about Lake Superior, then we have to take him or her at their word that that is about Lake Superior. What does it really mean is a whole nother story, because it depends on what emphasis the composer is putting on it and the performer. I put it on the psychological realm of the thing. And I explored that area because it's the least investigated area of music psychology. It's the least investigated area. When people think of music psychology, they think of it in therapeutical terms, like musical therapy and stuff like that. And that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this notion that music can express and show the psychological impact of an idea on a human being. That's what I'm looking at. And therefore, language can be implied in the terminology and the symbolic element of that music, but also in the interpretive meaning, as I just did then, relating to psychology or whatever. It could be philosophical, it could be poetic, it could be anything. But it truly is a language. Well, I think that music has a way of allowing people to understand something about themselves, and therefore gives them energy to make that effort to change their society. When I use words like occupy or for life, liberty, and justice and stuff like that, I'm implying that if we perform a successful occupy of our political and social and physical space, and organize a government around that, whether in power or not, it will change the society. Okay? I think where the Occupy movement lost its steam and kind of went into kind of underground, virtually no activity, is because the main participants in that movement, and I'm speaking more specifically about America because I live there, the main Pacific participants didn't understand the notion of defiance, social defiance. They didn't understand that. They, a lot of them were thinking in terms of wealth from their families and corporations and stuff like that. And they did not research the civil rights movement, which they should have done as part of their legacy. And therefore they were doomed to fail off of those grounds. You see, because the most successful movement in the world has been the various human rights movements throughout the world. That's most successful, you see. And one of the most successful boycotts in the history of the world took place in Montgomery, Alabama, when they had the bus boycott for 380 some days, where they had 100% participation. That you don't find those numbers anywhere in civil disobedience or defiance of standing rules and stuff like that. you know. And in the second part, they didn't have a Martin Luther King or Stokely Carmichael or James Baldwin. They just didn't have that in their movement. People that could articulate this idea about it. It should have been a successful movement, but to be successful in modern times, you have to understand a lot about what that means in terms of how you make this movement happen, and you have to actually engineer the results of it. You can't allow it to just spring and do this or do that. It has to be engineered. Yeah, well, you see, when you ask me how free am I, I'm looking to answer that on a personal level. Okay, let me say it this way: I'm a free man, and I'm free because I have determined my freedom, and I have not allowed and will not allow my freedom to be limited by traditions and blockage. Okay, and that's achievable purely within the contents of the individual. Okay, it means a similar notion about freedom that's articulated in Bob Marley's Song of Freedom. Other versions that were recorded and videoed, he used the word that he's a free man. And he means it in the same way that he has determined his freedom, and he does not allow it to be limited by traditions and other kinds of ways of thinking. Okay, that means that if my rights are denied, I would seek to have them litigated to overthrow them. If someone fears that I don't belong in a particular space for whatever reason, I would go in that space if it's a public space. They can't deny me that. I won't go in there fearing that something's going to happen to me. I will go in there thinking that this is my space also. I have a right to be there. And if that right have to be defended, that's the way life is. So what? You know?